It wasn't the silence that warned me. It wasn't the way she stopped humming in the kitchen the way she used to, or the way she'd started sleeping with her back to me like I was a wall instead of a husband. I'd been telling myself those things were just age, just the wear of 40 years together. I told myself a lot of things that year. None of them were true. I was 63 years old and I thought I knew my wife. We'd built everything together, the house in Dayton, the 2 kids. The garden she planted every spring along the back fence, the one she said calmed her down when the world got too loud. I thought I was part of that calm. I thought I was part of what kept her steady. It took a phone call from my daughter at 11:40 on a Tuesday night for me to understand that I wasn't any of those things, that I hadn't been for a long time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started on a Saturday morning in March. I remember because the light was coming through the kitchen window at that low angle it gets in early spring, the kind that makes everything look a little golden and a little sad at the same time. I was drinking my second cup of coffee. She was standing at the counter with her back to me, and she said it without turning around. She said she needed me to go stay with my brother for a while. I put my cup down. I said, "What do you mean, a while?" She turned then. Her face was composed. That's the word I'd use now, compose, the way you compose yourself before you say something you've been rehearsing. She said maybe a week, maybe 2. She said she needed space to think. She said we'd been living on top of each other since I retired and she just needed room to breathe. I asked her if something was wrong. She said no. She said she just needed this, and she hoped I could understand. I want to be honest with you about something. I didn't push back the way I probably should have. I was 63 years old and tired in a way that retirement doesn't fix, and part of me thought she was right that we had been in each other's way since I stopped working, that maybe a week apart would do us both some good. My brother lived about 3 hours away, outside of Columbus. We hadn't spent real time together in years. I told myself it could be good. I packed a bag and I kissed her on the cheek and she let me, and I drove away. My brother was glad to see me. We watched baseball and grilled in the backyard and talked the way men in their 60s talk when they've run out of small things to argue about and only the real things are left. I told him what my wife had said. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, quote, "Maybe she just needs the quiet." I nodded, like that made sense. I wanted it to make sense. The days went by. She texted me short things. How was my brother? Whether I'd remembered to leave the car insurance card in the glove box. Nothing that said I miss you. Nothing that said come home soon. I told myself some people aren't good with words. I'd been telling myself that for years. 9 days in, on a Tuesday, I was sitting on my brother's back porch reading when my phone rang. It was my daughter. She was calling from back home. She lived about 20 minutes from our house, had her own place, her own life. She was 29 years old and not someone who rattled easily. She was rattled. I heard it before she said a single word. The way she breathed in, the pause before she spoke. When she finally talked, her voice was barely above a whisper. She said, "Dad, there's something happening at your house." I sat up straight. I said, "What do you mean? What's happening?" She said she'd driven by on her way home from work because she'd been trying to call her mother all evening and couldn't reach her. She said, when she got to the street, she couldn't even turn into the driveway. She said there were police cars. She said there was tape. I said, "What kind of tape?" She said, "Dad, it's crime scene tape." I don't fully remember the next few minutes. I know I went inside and told my brother something had happened. I know I grabbed my keys. I know he offered to come with me, and I said no without thinking, just said no and got in the car and drove. 3 hours in the dark. I called my daughter twice during the drive. She'd parked down the street and was watching from a distance. She said there were 2 police cruisers and an unmarked car, and she'd seen someone being brought out on a stretcher, but she couldn't tell who it was, and she was too far away and too afraid to get closer. I asked her if she'd seen her mother. She said she hadn't. I drove faster. When I turned onto my street, I almost stopped the car. I know that sounds dramatic, but I need you to understand what it looks like to see your own home from the outside like that, with lights you don't recognize cutting across the yard and a line of yellow tape across the front walkway you laid yourself 20 years ago. It looks like a photograph of someone else's life. It looks like a mistake. An officer stopped me at the edge of the driveway. Young man, maybe 30. He asked me if I was the homeowner. I said yes. He asked me to wait and went to speak with someone else, another officer standing near the front door, and they looked at me and spoke in low voices, and the young one came back. He said there had been an incident at the property. I asked him where my wife was. He looked at me the way people look at you when they're deciding how much to say. Then he said she was being transported. He said I should come with him to the station. I want to stop here for a moment and tell you something I've heard other people say when they talk about moments like this. They say their mind went blank. Mine didn't. Mine went the opposite direction. Everything got very loud and very detailed, the way it does when your body understands something before you do. I noticed the way the officer's jacket was wrinkled at the sleeve. I noticed the light was on in my bedroom window, and I couldn't remember if I'd left it on when I left 9 days ago. I noticed my daughter had parked down the street and was walking toward me now, slowly, with her arms crossed against the cold. I should have asked for a lawyer right then. I didn't know that. I sat in that station for over an hour, and I answered questions I didn't have to answer because I had nothing to hide, and I thought that meant I had nothing to worry about. I know better now. If you ever find yourself sitting across from a detective at 11 o'clock at night, answering questions about your home while your wife is somewhere else, you ask for a lawyer first. You don't say a word, not one. It doesn't matter how innocent you are. You ask for a lawyer. I'm telling you that for free. What I learned that night, and then more over the days that followed, I'll piece together for you the way I pieced it together myself, slowly, with parts missing, with things that didn't make sense until they did. His name was a name I'd never heard before that night. He was 51 years old and he worked in commercial real estate. He and my wife had been meeting for, as best anyone could determine, somewhere between 18 months and 2 years. She had met him through a financial seminar she'd attended the winter before my retirement. One of those evening events at a hotel conference room. Glasses of wine. People talking about investment strategies. She'd mentioned the seminar at the time. She hadn't mentioned him. In the 9 days I was away, he had come to my house 4 times. The neighbors confirmed this later, not because they were watching, but because my wife had introduced him to the woman 2 houses down as a contractor who was helping her assess the value of the property. She'd been telling people we were thinking of selling. I did not know we were thinking of selling. On the Tuesday, I got the call from my daughter. Something had gone wrong between them. The details came out in stages over the following weeks, between what the police told me, what my wife eventually said, what her attorney confirmed during proceedings. The short version is this. He had been pressuring her for money, not small amounts. He had come to her with what he called an investment opportunity, and she had, over the course of several months, transferred close to $60,000 from our joint savings into an account he'd set up. On that Tuesday, she had apparently told him she was done. That she was going to tell me everything when I came home, and she needed him to stop contacting her. He had not taken that well. There had been a confrontation in the kitchen. My kitchen. At some point, he had put his hands on her. At some point after that, she had gotten to the cabinet near the back door where I kept a firearm I'd owned for 15 years and never once used. At some point after that, he was on the floor. She called 911 herself. She stayed on the line. She told them everything. He didn't die. I want to be clear about that. He was shot in the shoulder and he spent 3 days in the hospital, and then he was fine in the way that men like him are fine already talking to lawyers, already building a story. But the investigation was what it was, and my wife was charged, and the next several months of my life looked nothing like anything I had ever planned for. My daughter was the one who got me through those first weeks. She came over the morning after, and we sat in the kitchen, that same kitchen, and she made coffee, and I didn't drink it, and she talked to me with a steadiness she must have gotten from somewhere other than me, because I didn't have any steadiness left. She said, "Dad, we're going to figure this out." She said it more than once. I needed to hear it more than once. My son came in from out of state 3 days later. He was quieter about it. The way he's always been quiet, he processes things in his own time. Comes back to you with them later. He sat with me in the living room the first night he was there and didn't say much, just put the television on and stayed until I fell asleep in the chair. I woke up and he was still there. I don't know if he slept. The financial piece was almost harder to absorb than everything else. $60,000 from our joint account. Transferred over 14 months. I went back through the statements after the investigation, opened them up to me, and I could see it amounts between $2,000 and $8,000, spaced out irregularly, labeled in ways that looked like home repair or household expenses if you weren't looking closely. She had been careful. She had been doing this while I was in the other room, while we were eating dinner together, while I was thinking our marriage was just quieter than it used to be because that's what happens in your 60s. I've asked myself so many times whether there were signs, and the honest answer is that there were, but not the ones you'd expect. She wasn't distant the way you'd think a guilty person would be distant. She was actually, and I've turned this over so many times, she was sometimes more affectionate than she'd been in years. I thought that was retirement. I thought she was relieved to have me home. I understand now that it was guilt, or something alongside guilt, that the warmth was real, but the context was not what I thought it was. Her attorney entered a plea of self-defense. Given what the physical evidence showed, his fingerprints on her arm, the positioning in the room, her 9/11 call, the case was more complicated for the prosecution than it might have looked on the surface. But the financial element, the relationship, the fact that she had let this man into our home repeatedly without my knowledge, none of that helped her. The judge took all of it into account. She was convicted on a lesser charge than what was originally filed. She was sentenced to 9 years with the possibility of parole after 6. She stood in that courtroom in a blazer she'd bought for our daughter's college graduation years ago, and she looked at me once before they let her out. Just once. I don't know what either of us were looking for. I sold the house. I know some people might wonder about that choice. The house had been ours for 31 years, and my children grew up in it, and there were good things in those walls, real things, things that weren't part of any of this. But I also couldn't sleep in it anymore. I tried for 2 months after the trial, and I couldn't do it. The kitchen was the worst. I'd stand there in the morning, and I'd see it, not the actual event. I wasn't there for that, but my imagination had filled in what I hadn't seen, and I couldn't make it stop. I moved into a smaller place about 40 minutes away, still in Ohio, closer to my daughter. My son helped me pack, and he was methodical about it in a way that I needed someone to be, because I kept stopping to hold things that had no particular value and stare at them. He'd gently take them from me and put them in a box and keep moving. He's a good man. I don't say that enough. The money is mostly gone. Some of it was recovered, the investigation into him turned up enough to pursue a civil case, and I've been told I may recover a portion eventually, but eventually is a word that means less the older you get. I had my pension, and I had my brother, and I had my kids, and I told myself that was more than a lot of people had. Most days I believed it. I want to talk about the anger, because I think it would be dishonest not to. There was a long time where I woke up every morning, and the first thing I felt was rage. Not sadness. I got to sadness later, and sadness is actually easier to sit with. Rage is the one that wears you down. Rage at her, obviously, but also at myself, for the 9 days I'd spent at my brother's thinking everything was fine, for the years before that when I'd talked myself out of noticing things I probably should have noticed, for the way I'd handed her my whole trust like it was nothing. Like trust was something you could just give away indefinitely, with no conditions. My brother told me something that helped, eventually. He said, "You didn't fail a test you didn't know you were taking." He said it a few months after everything, sitting in his backyard the same way we'd been sitting when my daughter called. He said a lot of things that were wise in that simple way he has, and I argued with most of them and came around to them later, the way I always have with him. There are things I've had to forgive myself for. That's not something men my age were taught to do. We were taught to push through, to manage, to keep going. We were not taught to sit down with our own failures and examine them carefully without either excusing them or using them to flog ourselves forever. I'm learning. We ever won. One-sided down. I'm 64 years old, and I'm learning something I should have known at 35. That's not ideal, but it's what I have. My daughter got engaged this past fall. She called me on a Sunday evening, and I could hear the happiness in her voice before she said a single word, and it cracked something open in me that I hadn't realized was sealed. I cried after I got off the phone, alone in my kitchen, the new one, the smaller one that's mine and not a place where anything bad happened. Good tears, the kind that remind you that your life is still a life. My son and I have been going to his son's baseball games on weekends, when the season's on. My grandson is 8 and has absolutely no talent for baseball and plays with a kind of joyful indifference to the outcome that I find genuinely inspiring. We sit in the bleachers, and my son gets coffee from the concession stand, and we don't always talk much. We don't need to. Some of the best time you spend with people is the time you don't need to fill. I've thought a lot about what this story is actually about. It's tempting to make it about betrayal, because that's the sharpest part, the part you feel most in your chest. But I think the thing I've come to is that it's really about the stories we tell ourselves to stay comfortable. The ways we look at what's right in front of us and decide it means something other than what it means, because the real meaning is too disruptive. I was a man who loved his wife, and I think she loved me too, in whatever way she was capable of at the end of things. But I had been willing to leave certain doors closed for a long time because I didn't want to know what was behind them. That's not her failure alone. That's mine, too. I'm not saying that to excuse what she did. There is no excuse for what she did. Not to me, not to our children, not to the truth of what our life was supposed to be. I'm saying it because if I walk away from all of this having only learned something about her, I haven't actually learned anything. She's been in for almost a year now. I don't go to see her. My daughter did, once, and came home and cried for an hour and then said she needed more time. My son hasn't gone. He may never go. That's his to carry the way he needs to carry it. I don't wish her harm. That took a while to get to, but I'm there now. I wish her honestly, I wish her the kind of quiet she said she needed that March morning at the kitchen counter. I wish she'd been able to find it some other way, one that didn't burn everything down around her. But you can't want different choices for someone else. All you can do is try to make better ones yourself. The last thing I'll say is this. There's a version of the last few years I could have lived where I never knew any of this, where I stayed at my brother's a few more days, came home, and she had found a way to close the door on all of it and keep it closed, and I would have gone on thinking my marriage was a quiet thing that had just lost some of its color with age. I'm not sure that version would have been better. I'm not sure the not knowing would have been the gift it feels like from a distance. The truth is hard, and it is also, when everything else burns away, the only ground you can stand on that doesn't eventually give way. I'm 64. I have my kids. I have my brother. I have a smaller kitchen and an 8-year-old who plays outfield with the enthusiasm of someone who has never heard of an error. I have mornings. I have the kind of tiredness that comes from actual work, from figuring something difficult out, rather than the kind that comes from holding up a version of things that was never real. That's not nothing. Some days, if I'm honest with you, it feels like almost everything.